And the coronavirus, the virus, has not changed very much in this respect, because although most political entities, independent political entities, sovereign or not, assume the general responsibility for facing the coronavirus, in all cases, they tend to integrate their policies within the general axiom that main thing that the political power is obliged to cater for is economic capitalist development. And to the extent that there is a contradiction between immediate development and welfare and health, it is obvious that health cannot prevail as a, if you like, a general value against the unique, one-sided, and well, without any alternative axiom that all states must serve diligently the axiom that the only thing that one can do is serve capitalist development, productivity, and all the rest goes with it. Now, this is not the first time that something like that happens. The ecological problem is similar.
Yes.
Because, and the climatic catastrophes that go on all over the world cannot be solved otherwise by a political will that cannot work otherwise than being independent from economic forces. But that cannot take place today, and that is why the whole thing seems to be leading towards an impasse. You need politics to change the notion of progress. You need politics to debate other alternatives for the world, but to the extent that the politics is by now dependent on the generally universal productivist consensus, politics is not capable of taking binding decision on the universal level. And that is, in my opinion, what we are facing today, a kind of extreme, I would say, contradiction that is a very old contradiction, started from the 19th century, but never before has the contradiction been so obvious, and never before has this contradiction been so insoluble and menacing.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the summary. I'm going to introduce everybody, and we can pick it up here, and maybe Francis can, say some things as well. And I'm sure Peter and I both have some interventions to make. So I welcome everybody. This is the first of a podcast brought to you by the Situations Journal. We have a new little podcast. There'll be 5 of them called Situating the Conjuncture, essays from situations that speak to an understanding of the current moment. And we're going to begin today with our friend from Greece and also Paris, previously and many time participant here in New York, both in classes at Columbia and special groups from Situations, Konstantinos Tsoukalas, and we're going to be dealing with his essay, The Deregulation of Morals, the Ultimate Phase of Globalization, from spring of 2012, which he just opened with a very nice summary of in terms of the continuity of this essay for today's moment. We're also joined by Francis Piven, of course, author of Regulating the Poor and More and Poorer People's Movements and the breaking of the American Social Compact, as well as more recently, Who's Afraid of Frances Fox Piven, ? Her essay essays of recent date, which was a take from Glenn Beck calling her one of the most dangerous people in America. So anyway, we welcome both the creatively dangerous from here in the States and also our friend from Athens. And thank you very much, Konstantinos, for this and for your good summary. So, Francis, I mean, would you mind maybe giving a little bit of comment on what Konstantinos had opened with in terms of the article? Yeah.
Well, I'm having a little trouble with the audio.
Oh, you are?
I
Okay.
could not hear, I could not understand Konstantinos' summary. But
Okay.
I did want to talk a little bit about how I see the current conjuncture, and mainly
Right.
about the bearing of globalization on our understanding of state and society and their relations. I think that we usually think of globalization and the acceleration of communication and transportation and exchange across borders as empowering capital, which is it's a continuation of the developments of the 19th century, through which capital, by being mobile, gained more leverage over politics and especially democratic politics. But I think that there's another way of looking at globalization that holds more promise for democracy and popular power. Because the issue is power. The issue is what classes, what strata, what groups will have leverage in over our social arrangements and our economic arrangements. And I think that the usual view is that the acceleration of mobility across borders disempowers subaltern groups, disempowers groups at the bottom of society. I'm not sure that that's true. I think we're very much in the grip of a kind of 19th and early 20th century view of popular mobilization and popular leverage, a view that really is descended from the Third International and the idea that power is the result of the concentration of people as production workers in a proletarian relationship with capital. But I think that globalization has potentially changed that the multiplication of connectivity, the multiplication of the expansion of the embrace of capitalist relations, that together this connectivity and expansion creates the possibility for new kinds of popular power that have not yet been explored, or have been explored only episodically and in particular places. Globalization means, among many things, it means an extremely intricate and extensive set of cooperative relations. Because all kinds of working people in communications, in transportation, people who work for the investment sector of the economy, all kinds of people make a contribution to economic and therefore political and social relations. The fragility of this system has not been explored and has not been, in a sense, taken advantage of. And that fragility, I think, creates actually democratic possibilities. It's very similar to the old idea of how port workers, because they were at the nexus of transportation, could have great leverage on capital. That was true. It was episodically demonstrated through port worker strikes. But now, with the intensification of relationships and the extended chains of production, extended chains of communication, extended chains of transportation, the productivity of the system depends on many, many people, including many people who are usually thought of as at the bottom of societies. And this development, I think, also, which we have mainly, I think, bemoaned as bad for democratic possibilities, actually creates new democratic possibilities because so many different people, strata, classes, nations, are essential contributors to the complex network of relationships that constitute the modern global economy.
Right. Okay. Peter, you want to intervene here? We have a thing about the new forms of agency. Obviously, new questions. Amazon workers of the world unite in some ways, yeah, etc. Right. So you want to try to bridge this. Francis didn't hear Konstantinos so well, so maybe you can frame it.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, to me, Konstantinos' essay
yeah.
is fundamental, I think, as an appendix to Norbert Elias in the civilizing process, because the older arguments have been that as there is increasing interdependencies, as there is an increased network of trade and exchange, and the kinds of forms of cooperation that Francis mentioned, that engenders a cultural transformation. That engenders a cultural transformation. That result in things like, not only, of course, it's not only table manners and all the rest, but things then like social democratic policies, where there is a recognition of the interdependencies and a extending of certain levels of supports and benefits to people who you don't know, who you don't know personally, they're not related to you, but there is not only, of course, an economic functionality to it, but it fits with the kind of cultural transformation that occurs because of these forms of interdependence and the way that you have to be able to establish a certain kind of selflessness. It is an interesting paradox of capitalism that, on the one hand, of course, you have the impetus to be self-interested above all else, but at the same time, this is also part of these extended forms of exchange that result in these processes. Of course, as we know from Elias and others, things can go awry, things can change. And I think what Konstantinos does, and the essay begins, of course, with a little quote from Hamlet, "Time is out of joint." I think Konstantinos shows the importance of the change in the temporal character of contemporary globalized capitalism. That the kind of long run functionality and logic of accumulation that went hand in hand with this older idea of exchange and interdependence now is vanishing. And I think, I mean, just to give some examples, when we look to the right wing today, we see a marked difference with the right wing of the 1930s, let's say. Many people like to equate Trump and others, we have many, many examples, of course, today, from Brazil, the United States to the UK and onwards, of these authoritarian figures, neo-fascist, quasi-fascist, whatever. But there's a marked difference, that the fascists were very much in support of social welfare, collective goods. Today, the right is radically libertarian. Today, the right is radically libertarian. And I think, for example, Konstantinos' essay helps to explain why that may be the case. What has changed in the way capitalism works? And it's two things, that they are mutually, of course, related. One is, as he shows, that in this level of globalization, what increases much more than, it's not just olive oil and, Mercedes is being shipped across borders. First and foremost is the exchange of securities. And I think in the numbers in the piece, Konstantinos has, it went up to about 1999. Since then, of course, it has exploded even more. So that there is, as a percentage of GDP, you have something like 1,000%, 1,000% for places like the United States, Italy, France, and so forth. 1,000% of yearly GDP, over 1,000%, is just costs national flows of securities. That goes hand in hand with a shrinking of the temporal horizon of capitalism. And I believe Konstantinos says now it goes to about 24 months. It's about a 2-year horizon. Both from the standpoint of your individual measures of success. If you're working for Goldman Sachs, you're not building your career to show that in 30 years or 40 years, your decisions were profit making. You have to make the money within the next 24 months. Otherwise, you're a failure. Even in academia, we see this today. We see this merry-go-round of administrative, this parasitic administrative class. They no longer stay in the same institution for 30 years. They stay in an institution for 3-4 years and they move on. Otherwise, you're a failure. So it's that movement, what in dependency theory used to be called comprador capitalism. I think Konstantinos is arguing is now all of capitalism is comprador, even when it's tied to certain kinds of national moments and national spaces. The temporal horizon that has changed has shrunk to such, so even they are largely indifferent to the domestic local situation because they're so tied to the international flows and movements. They cannot afford to be connected to the local economy, which in fact, of course, they're also dependent upon, but they don't have the luxury of time to worry about these things.
Peter, if I could just add, speaking of short-termism, most of investment, traders, speculators are based on a 3-month model of the earnings season. Quarterly earnings dictate everything. And trillions of dollars, right, in, quote, money capital and then even further derivative capital are being, exchanged in this moment, right? In these transnational, without borders, etc. So this is always important to remember that we've switched in some ways, even though, production is obviously necessary. We really are in this age of financialization, that it really dictates so much. And this is maybe the shift. Konstantinos has a section on the demise of collective time-space continuum. The time is out of joint because it's been so compressed, right? And by the way, Deleuze opens his book on Kant's critical philosophy with the same quote. The time is out of joint from Hamlet, in terms of Kantian time, which is interesting because, as we know, capitalism has been known to move on Newtonian, Kantian, temporal schemas. So this is very interesting as a quotation that both you and Deleuze use. One, yours in your analysis of where we are in globalization, and Deleuze in his study returned to Kant's critical philosophy. So anyway, I just wanted to, say. And then when you say 1,000%, the derivative markets are much more than that. We're still dealing with all this floating paper out there that has not come due yet and may never come due, but actually builds. The new thing is you speculate in I think social capital firm in Silicon Valley is worth studying. What they do is they just they blank check capitalism now for venture firms in Silicon Valley. Anything that has to do with new technology. This is coming out of the Facebook crowd that went their own way. And it's called, and certainly worthy of study too, because what they're doing now is funding startups like crazy. And this is a new thing. And they'll just write the blank check, whatever it takes. So this, to me, this is, please. Yeah, Francis. Yeah.
If we're onto something,
Yeah.
An important truth about our new reality, it should be evident in other institutions than economy and state. I think, for example, of the importance of the family in forcing capital to have a future orientation, which I think that everybody who has said this, Konstantinos, Michael, and so forth, is right. There is a kind of short-termism, which is, it's new, it's startling, and it's frightening. But there was a time, a century ago, when capitalists like Carnegie, for example, were thinking about their grandsons and their great-grandsons.
Right.
If we're right, they're not thinking about that anymore. But that has a really big jolting effect on family relations, because what is the family? Accepting the continuity of the genes of the grandfather, the great-grandfather, through the decades. So in a way, we can explore this and maybe amplify it, but maybe correct it by looking at institutions that are seriously anchored to the time horizons of capital.
Interesting, yeah. Konstantinos, please, yeah.
I'd like to come back to the question of how this condensation of time, how it affects, and very seriously so, I think, what we are consider as ethics, the moral codes. I think it's very important to note that I'll say something else. It's no accident that Hayek, who is probably the Pope of neoliberalism, I don't know how he's considered in the States actually, but I think he is the Pope.
They only read him in Chicago, unfortunately. The Pope of Chicago School. Yeah.
He made the following remark, that at last, the free market now has rendered it possible to treat other persons as means to our proper end. That is, what does that mean? It means that the Kantian conception of ethics, moral, as it has been dominated the European thought and the American, the Western thought for the last 200 years at least, is being substituted by a new theory of morals where everybody is only responsible for himself and can desire and exploit anybody and anything that's beyond himself. It is no accident that I would say that most, if not all, traditional moral codes, including the capitalist bourgeois code, has elements of what we know we have known as the 10th commandment. The 10th commandment is what? You cannot desire what belongs to the others, what belongs to your neighbor. By now, not only are you urged to desire whatever belongs to your neighbor, but you are considered an idiot, an unrealist, and a failure if you cannot desire and put into effect your jealousy or your ressentiment vis-a-vis everybody else. You have this new competition, the notion of competition. It's not only economic competition, it's a symbolic competition. It is a general competition. It is general comparability, the compulsive comparability of everybody towards everybody else. It is precisely what Rousseau, in Émile, if I'm not mistaken, has underlined as being the worst possible thing in the world, to compare yourself constantly with all the others. Now, I'm not saying that this has happened generally, but by now you do have a moral glissement, a kind of modification of the basic ethical rules, because by now whoever does not play this game of total commitment to all opportunities, it's this notion of opportunity, which is extremely important, because we can talk about the importance of the ideology of equality of opportunity, but that's not the question. The question is, if one does not, whoever does not try to grasp all opportunities, is considered not only a failure, but also a coward. This is a new conception of personalized ethics. And this is I think this should be brought into contact with what Francis said before about the notion of the family. Families are changing rapidly within very, very short-term notions, and families by now do not have stable, long-term conception that solidarity is obvious. Solidarity is not obvious anywhere, nowhere. And this renders, well, the reproduction of the system of capitalist relation, it renders much easier, because by now there is no general ideological possibility for waging war against this system, which is considered as the objective embodiment of universal transhistorical rationality, and it also gives birth to a new conception of what the individual can do and should do on his own. This is, I believe, one of the reasons why, by the last 20 years at least, or 30 years, you have not had nowhere, any serious political and social upheaval against this dominant system. And there is where as far as I'm concerned, I'm very pessimistic about what's going to happen in the next years.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Francis, you want to reply to that? He seems to be setting up something, outside of your sort of optimism of the movements that are possible today. And
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm optimistic. I'm tentative. I'm uncertain.
Well,
anybody who is not uncertain is absolutely a lunatic.
Okay. We'll go with that. I like that.
But
right.
Konstantinos' comments make me wonder, because there was a time, maybe a century ago, when American intellectuals, in a way, first discovered the culture of laissez-faire, the culture of capitalism, the personalities created by capitalism. And this discovery was reflected not so much in social science, but in American literature, in the work, the novels of people like Sinclair Lewis and Upton Sinclair.
Theodore Dreiser. Yeah.
Theodore Dreiser.
Right.
Novels which fastened on the character of people who were total opportunists,
Right.
And
right.
totally concerned with their own aggrandizement. This they thought was the culture created by markets, by capitalism. And I think they were right. It was the personalities created by the virtually unregulated market. And aren't we just seeing a continuation of this process, of a process where the basic economic arrangements shape individuals and shape group life, collective life, and people, of course, react against this, and the reactions against it are what we have to thank for whatever humane institutional arrangements we have. But is it new, is what I'm saying. Is it new, or is it a continuation and expansion and deepening of the imprint of capitalist relations on personality, culture, collective life?
Yeah. I think you pointed, though, Francis, to something that's very interesting. The Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, all fortunes made during the period you speak to, right? And steel, autos, even maybe even the DuPonts too. All of these foundations had some kind of social commitment. They were also sort of interested in giving grants to education, to building a kind of society and a culture of learning to a degree. I'm not so sure we have that today, but again, to go back to fiction, if you look at a character like Meyer Wolfsheim in The Great Gatsby, Arnold Rothstein in real life, the gambler who fixes the 1909 World Series, I agree with you in terms of characters. We have these types all over the place, going on, from Michael Cohen, the fixer for Donald Trump, who's now singing like a canary. We have these kind of characters in American, life and society, and nothing's really changed at that level. But again, I guess we can go back to Konstantinos, because he's saying that there's a shift here, in capital. But I agree that the figures, the representatives in a way, the flamboyance that we saw in these characters of the 1920s is very much still with us in the entertainment industry. On the Twitter culture, in a certain way, even this is playing out. And our
Wall Street.
Yeah, and Wall Street, yes. Yeah, exactly. But I think we're speaking to different structural things too, but I'm going to turn it over to Konstantinos, since you seem to say that there's a continuity, going way back. So maybe he can reply to this. Yeah. Francis was saying that there's not much new under the sun since the 1920s, to put it in basic terms.
Well, I want to.
What's new in your research? Yeah. I'm sorry.
That's always going to be true, of course, in any society.
Yeah, of course.
That the economic moment, or whatever you want to call it, also influences culture and ethics and all these things. But the question is how, in this case, how is the new functioning of the new strategy of accumulation, this new temporal character of capitalism that Konstantinos discusses, how that changes things, and I think, of course, there are, I wouldn't say the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation were, great for education or anything else, Michael.
But they have that on their mind.
They gave money, I think, in the same way that the Gates Foundation gives money to education, and I think the net effect is we cannot say these are great philanthropic projects per se, but of course there is a difference. One, you know, in a sense, I think maybe Trump is too easy of a target, but if we think to someone like what's his name, the great from Omaha, Nebraska, the great
Warren Buffett.
Warren Buffett, in contrast to these others, because Buffett is, you know, presumably much nicer than Trump or these others. But, you know, look at the contrast. Look at the contrast with the older, you know, is not some kind of great foundation he creates, if, you know, nor even, you know, in the old idea of conspicuous consumption, Veblen and the others. You don't even see that, you know, because Buffett's whole ethical, let's say, that his ethos is to be frugal. You eat hamburgers for lunch, you drive a 10-year-old Cadillac, and then you accumulate for the sake of accumulation. If anything, it's more perverse than the Carnegies and the Fords.
Yeah, agree. Yeah. Konstantinos, please, yes, yeah. Yeah.
It seems to be obvious that America cannot function the same way as the other countries, for the simple reason that in America, in the United States, the articulation between big capital and the state and political power is still balanced, I would say. Outside America, in all small countries, probably also not Russia and China, but all smaller countries do not have a national bourgeoisie anymore. Why? Because national bourgeoisies all over Europe, and all over the world, were created in cohabitation and mutual dependence with their proper states. They invested in their environment. They were protected by means of the state from foreign competitors, largely, and they had all the class interest was more or less coincided more or less in the long term with the notion of a nation state. This is not the case anymore, because in all medium countries, capital, small capital or medium capital, is obliged to play the game of globalized game of finance. It's obliged to seek for opportunities all over the world. The Greek capitalists, not only ship owners, but all of them, are like most financiers in the world. They play around between Russia, Africa, Latin America, and they change every day their strategies and tactics. In this sense, they have absolutely no reason to depend on their social and political environment, which is the state of the society which is Greece. And the same takes place everywhere. In most cases, I would think that national bourgeoisies have practically disappeared, which in turn changes very many things in the internal political struggles within all countries. This alone is enough to indicate how the dominance of new financial, transnational and international concerns, it has directly influenced the contours of political struggle within most countries. That means the politics of all medium and small countries are to an extreme degree. It is very difficult for anybody, be it from the left, coming from the moderate left or coming from the right, it's extremely difficult for anybody to work in terms of a domestically organized and founded capitalism. That means it is now by now almost impossible for all small countries or medium countries to decide on their own road towards progress and socialism. They can have no other alternative but to accept and try to play the game of international capital in a competitive way. And that is enough, I think, to change the political balances all over the world. I'm not speaking of the United States because the United States, as China and Russia probably, are exceptions because they're enormous and political power still exists and can counterbalance to a certain extent the domestic capital. But elsewhere, globalization has led to a total gagging of political alternatives. And that, is my opinion, is extremely negative and extremely problematic.
And I think to add to that, even in these larger countries, the United States, China, Russia, and so forth, even there, I think it's an open question.
Yes.
Because, you know, to given it the Trump tax cuts, if one of the arguments was, and maybe it's disingenuous or it's not completely accurate, but I think there's some truth to it, that if we want to bring back all the money that is in between, as it were, you know, in these offshore banking centers, which as Konstantinos has pointed out, it's not a coincidence that the same place the pirates used to hide their money, or the same places now the capitalists still, of course, you know, the Cayman Islands and Panama and so forth. Only here they haven't brought it. This used to be a pirate stronghold, but the cash is not come here yet. So even there, the United States, the argument was, we have to decrease capital gains tax if we want the big corporations to bring some of that money back, which says a lot. Because I think it also has to do with what Francis has written about greatly, which is the way the social movements succeed, the kind of interdependent power and how it works out, which to me is very much in the tradition, in some ways, not only of Elias, who I mentioned before, but Karl Polanyi, you know, and the Great Transformation, this kind of double movement that exists. That presupposed at least two fundamental things. One, that you can cause trouble, whether you're peasants, you know, in the English countryside, or your dock workers in San Francisco, or one that you can cause trouble. And secondly, though, that the state can impose on capital certain concessions, that the market is not allowed to become disembedded from society through that mechanism. Now, I think, again, to add to the pessimism, the capacity for this is true, of course, in the outside of the big countries. Maybe even the big countries, it's less true than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, certainly. The capacity to impose on capital certain concessions, to the degree that that becomes weakened, it also means that the possibilities of reform by way of social movements become decreased. And now you have, I think, an all or nothing situation. Either you get the guns and you take over, or nothing is going to change. You know, to cause some disruption and the state to ensure some long-term reproducibility of the system, long-term cohesion, imposes certain concerns. That is no longer the case. If reform is no longer possible in that sense, either we get the guillotines out and we get the guns, or nothing, you know, it's all or nothing situation, I feel at this point.
I'm going to let the older generation. I'm in the middle of this. I'm getting to older, but the elders, the wise elders, respond to this. Yeah, Konstantinos. Yeah, yeah.
Well, what I wanted to say that Akis mentioned Polanyi, Karl Polanyi.
Okay.
He talked about disembeddedness.
Yes.
I would say that Polanyi indicates the importance of the phenomenon of disembeddedness of markets from society. But I think it was wrong at the time, because 60 or 100 years ago, markets were not yet totally disembedded from society. The disembeddedness, or the almost total disembeddedness, is a phenomenon that has taken place in the last 20, 30 years. And it is this total disembeddedness that renders all reaction, social reaction to, and political reaction to what is taking place much more difficult. What Aki said before is, in my opinion, a confirmation ex post facto of the Polanyian scheme. And it's very important to use, I think, the notion of disembeddedness, which is, in my opinion, a fundamental notion to understand what's the relation between politics and power and economics is and can be. That's all I want to do.
Yes, and this is on, for our listeners, on page 11 in substance in your article on structural disembeddedness in the article, in the early section of the article. Anyway, Fran, you want to respond to Peter's revolution against reform, so to speak?
I'm too uncertain.
Okay.
I have to say uncertainty is sort of the prevailing mood, idea, mental frame that many of us have at this point in time. And I can't think how it could be otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Particularly if you take into account not only state-society relations and the kinds of things that we are talking about, but if you take into account the climate threats that have been so pronounced in the United States, particularly over the last year. The numbers of hurricanes, I'm suspended. I don't know what's going to happen in 3 weeks, much less
But yeah, right.
3 years, 30 years.
Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah, this is interesting. So we're back in 1943 with Jean-Paul Sartre. Everything's contingent, right? And we're in this uncertain position. Interesting. Yeah, in Vichy in some ways. Yeah. Yeah, Konstantinos. Yeah, please. Yeah.
I just add, just found it, a poem by Emily Dickinson. Crumbling, she says, is not an instant act. A fundamental pause. Dilapidation processes are organized decay. I think it's very appropriate to our present situation.
Yes. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Peter, you want to say some more about this? Yeah, about your notion of the all or nothing, the risk. In a certain way, we're in this position of contingency, but contingency always has risk involved with it, of course. And this was, yeah.
I'm simply making an empirical observation.
Yes, I understand. Yeah.
The movements that one could imagine 50 years ago would have been extremely consequential. Pressure from below in various forms. Today seem to go, they happen, they pass, and the impact is zero or almost zero. So again, the system seems to become less able to impose some concessions on capital, to translate social movements into some kind of policy. I'm not against, I don't say I'm against reform. I would be very happy with many reforms. I have no problem, but it seems to me the system is no longer with, I think Konstantinos is right, there are partial exceptions. China, of course, has proven to be much more capable of dealing with issues. The pandemic being one example, than most other places. Russia, the United States, may be partial examples. But again, to speak from the standpoint of the Greek experience of the last 10 years or so, it was an immense social upheaval that had zero, in essence, zero impact on social policy. Zero impact on social policy. No shift from austerity politics and all the rest, even in the face of, you know, very many general strikes and upheavals, even electing into office
Elections body.
by contemporary standards, a very far left government. The consequences was zero. So I mean, so for me, yes, I mean, I don't say we can predict the future, but looking at the last 10, 15 years, you see that the impact of these movements have been at best minimal. So again, it points out to a certain crisis, you know, a crisis of reproducibility in the long run, but also a crisis of a social agency and power, where the old mechanism of of protest and disruptions become less and less effective and capable of engendering some kind of policy reform.
Right. And I think another thing that we haven't really touched upon is, you know, in Konstantinos's article, is the shamelessness of these people, the deregulation of morals that is going alongside of this. There's no one held accountable or responsible in this moment. So we have this too, at least during the 20s, you had The Shame of the Cities made into the film Scarface with, you know, Paul Muni. And, you know, we have these kind of moments of we have a culture of kind of, you know, investigative journalism, but it does no good. You know, you can tell everybody in the world what Trump does with tax evasion, tax avoidance, what he does and everything. Most people don't really care at this point. And we've gotten into this level, right, of where Nietzsche's genealogy of morals has really become, in terms of it's completely deregulated. Again, the deregulation is the, you know, the Kantian idea of regulation, the idea of regulation and how we constitute things. So we've lost this ethical moral compass, you know, which Bernard Stiegler calls we've retreated into symbolic misery constantly, and this dominates so much of everyday life. So I think this is another important thing. This
raise a question about that characterization of what has happened.
Okay.
I don't think it's not clear to me
Okay.
that the reason that, for example, in the United States, a criminal ruling regime is
Right.
still in power, at least at this moment. And I don't attribute the reason to the sort of indifference of individuals, their moral neutrality with regard to the stealing that has characterized the American government overall, but especially in the last few years. I think it has more to do with the helplessness that people feel, not their moral indifference or their moral impunity. And I think given the opportunity, given the exemplary strategy of a forward part of the potential movement, that people would react very, very differently. Look, for example, at Black Lives Matter, the name given to the great movement in the United States over the last couple of years, and only the last couple of years, a movement that most observers agree is the largest in American history, and a movement that, for the first time in history, was authentically biracial. That is still happening, and that reflects not moral indifference, but a passion and an intensity that is the reflection of the indifference and brutality of the federal administration. I think that the generalizations we're making are not sensitive to recent developments.
But I think, Francis, the question is not whether it is possible for people. I don't, you know, no one is saying people no longer care about that.
Yeah, right. Right.
The question is how effective those actions are in engendering some kind of reform, some kind of transformation of policies of the regime, and so forth. And I think also still on Black Lives Matter, it's an open question in terms of what will—
It's an open question. It's an open question. We don't know what its impact will be.
That's true, but the example I gave before of the Greek situation, that's in the past tense. There we know, and we know that the impact was zero, for example. It was zero. It had no substantive impact in the last instance on the
I mean, the protests against austerity politics?
Yes. Yes, we could go further back and talk about, for example, the anti-war movements, you know, that preceded the invasion of Iraq, for example, which was it was not as big as Black Lives Matter, but it was a sizable movement in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere. And the impact was now it's not the first time this happens, of course, but you know, we have many examples of the recent past. I remember being in London in the lead up to the war in Iraq, and you know, I was in the demonstrations in New York. The ones in London were even much more impressive. 1 million people. It was
we had close to 1 million here. Yeah.
And I'm saying in London it was
amazing. Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, yeah.
I thought there's no way they're going to do it, and they did it, and they were elected. The government invaded Iraq, and they were reelected.
Compared to what? The labor movement in Europe and the United States unfolded over a period of at least a century and a half. Each of its victories was very painfully won and very stingily responded to. The examples of protest movements making large gains, indeed the example even of revolutions making large gains all at once, are not numerous.
You want to reply, Konstantinos? This is about the, we all lived through the tragedy of Syriza, I kind of call it now, that attempt to confront austerity politics just to add to Francis in a sense, I mean, to me, there's a kind of diminution from the Black social movements of the 60s into Black Lives Matter, even though this is a much larger movement and maybe opens up some help. But remember, it was civil rights and then Black freedom and Black power back then. Now it's about the biological, the lives matter because of the police, brutality. This has been the organizing principle, not so much about Black empowerment or Black identity in a way. To my mind, at least, this is somewhat the way I read it. But yes, please, go ahead, Konstantinos. Yeah. Again, we don't hear you. Yeah.
I don't know what to do.
Me either. I'm with you. None of us know what to do.
I agree with Francis that what is taking place in the United States now is extremely interesting. It's obviously the most important mass movement in the States for the last, 50 years, even more than that, probably. Right. So we don't know what's going to happen. We all hope that it might materialize into something much more substantial on the political level, but that's an open question. But in Greece, which I know better, we have had 10 years of economic crisis, which has rendered, the level of welfare has been reduced by 20 or 25%, even more than that in 10 years. Measures of austerity, which were extremely important. My pension, for example, has been reduced by 60% or something like that. My pension,
yes. Yeah, wait.
But that's not the point. The point is that we did have a long period of social turbulence. The left, Syriza, was elected into power, and they could not change very much. They were obliged. They were so pressured by the international capital and by the European system, they were obliged to continue with the austerity measures. They probably could have done something else. The pressure was so enormous everywhere that that you would have either total economic and social collapse, or they would have to manage the austerity in a way that was more acceptable than other ways. I'm not saying that they did well or badly. I'm explaining that within the system of international capital development today, and for the last 5 years, at least 10 years at least, it is extremely difficult for a small country with limited resources and with, even if for a left-wing government, to change things radically, to reform substantially. I'm not talking about social democratic, a new social democratic program, but even the left, which Syriza was much more to the left of, theoretically at least, of the European social democracy. But that's not the point. They could not take the risk of social explosion, which would follow a total, well, collapse of the Greek economy. So they gave in, for the better or for the worse. The point is that it is, I don't know who else could possibly do anything else but to give in. Because the same thing has happened all over Europe and all over the world, that social democrats have adopted the agenda of, mainly adopted the agenda of the right wing, of the conservatives, of liberals, and even the left has been obliged to adopt the same agenda. So where are we? Where is the object of political struggle in all these small countries, at least medium-sized countries? What does this struggle consist in? And there, the question, I don't know. I cannot predict. We can hope. We can realize that what's taking place in the United States is extremely important, but you cannot define, on the basis of what we know today, a definite strategy which would make us hope for something that can happen in the years to come. And that is what I said before. I'm not very optimistic that things can change in Europe, at least, in the next years to come.
Konstantinos, would you say we're still under the Tina syndrome that you, of course, speak to, in the article? There is no alternative. The famous Maggie Thatcher, quote from the early '80s. Yeah.
Nobody would use the word Tina.
Right. I'm sorry, we can't hear you again. I'm sorry. Yeah. Say again, please. Yeah.
Thatcher is not quoted.
Yeah.
There is an alternative, because there is only one way to manage the affairs, is to follow the transcendental, universal, transhistorical market rationality. And whoever dares to challenge this rationality is punished. Punished not with bombs, but with financial means that renders you totally incapable of having a country survive. That is, I believe, the main reason why globalization has managed really to reduce the scope of all political systems all over the world. And that is the reason why there is no question of some political globalization that will probably change but a world government is impossible for the time being, at least. Kant's dreams are absolutely out of the question. We cannot materialize today, and the United Nations and things like that have never even conceived of the possibility of a central universal state. So this is, nobody wants it. Nobody would have reacted against it. All national countries, national states no national state would accept it. And on the other hand, it would be anathema for capital. So how can we conceive of a universal government which would think of politics in new terms, in new global international terms? It's, for the time being, it's impossible.
Francis, you want to respond to the impossibility or the possibility of impossibility here?
I think that what we're raising, what Konstantinos particularly is raising, is a phenomenon that's been apparent in American politics for some time, although it's not much discussed by American political scientists. And that is the disjuncture between the levels of government at which capital operates and the levels of government at which electoral politics is dominant. And that's very, very important. The generalization that Konstantin made a couple of minutes ago about the impossibility of a central governmental authority that would encompass the scale of operation of global capital is, in a way, a reproduction of American political history, because the capital moved from state capitals to the national capital, and it moved in a way that gave it leverage at particular points in historical time. I think there are lessons to be drawn from that history for the future of the possibility of democratic governance on a world scale, because globalization means, if it means anything, it means that democracy has to be worldwide. It means that the centers of political decision-making have to be international. Otherwise, globalization is a joke.
Okay. Yes, I like this. From the ultimate face of globalization to the joke of globalization. This is very good. Yeah, Peter, anything you'd like to add to this? Yeah. And it's been very, very obviously stimulating. I know we're at the level of what Althor used to call generalities one, but with a lot of ideas in those to be taken forward. And yeah. Any thoughts, Peter? Yeah.
Well, I think the pandemic is an interesting complication, let's say, of the process. On the one hand, I think it underscores Konstantinos' emphasis on this question of individual agency and morality and so forth. We see, for example, those who refuse to wear a mask.
Refuse to do what? I'm sorry? Oh, masks. Oh, yeah.
One more illustration, and of course, it's not universal globally, and even in places like the United States, it's much more prevalent in some areas of the country as opposed to others. But it shows a certain lack of, to go back to our friend Elias, a certain lack of civility, a certain incapacity to put your own desires, to control your own desires for the sake of others, or to show others that you can be counted on.
And it's also madness, Peter, because it's not only other people that you're hurting, but yourself.
Right.
Well, but I think that's another dimension, because I think to go back to democracy, people are so unfree. Really, people are so unfree and lack so much agency.
Right.
That's all they have left. For them to go to the supermarket and choose which toilet paper they want to buy is a great act of agency and freedom. That's what is left. They have no, agency in terms of what kind of career they might have, whether they have a job or not, and so forth. So much is beyond their control. That's all they have left, in a sense.
But I think, Francis, in terms of this notion of contingency or the uncertainty facing all of this, and is really speaking to a way of what you're also saying, that people are afraid of their freedom. We gave a course on this, as you remember, that people are afraid, escape from freedom based on Fromm's, great 1941 text, that people will deny their freedom, they will escape from it. They will not take it up. And this is the moment of contingency that we're in, And I think also Francis makes a good point. I'll just transfer this to the financial sector, the disconnect between government and especially the disconnect of finance capital with the real economy. We were sitting on something where Trump, basically with the help of the Federal Reserve Bank and the printing of money, et cetera, and the first time the Federal Reserve Bank has started to bail out corporations, the airline industry, General Motors, all these things, that we have seen a 40 to 45% increase off the lows of the stock market, right? Everybody's gotten their pension money back. So the middle class is sort of, satisfied. Oh, my TIA craft went up. And at the same time, you're dealing with a real economy that probably in real terms is 20 to 25% unemployment and probably 50% underemployment. Right. So this is another thing that we're, obviously going through in terms of this disruptions about central government and, quote, what's going on the ground. Yeah. So
again, we have, that is one example of some of the culture.
Right.
But that the nation state still has great capacity when it comes to controlling borders, controlling.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It is not a technical problem. It is a political problem. But they have no desire, of course, to control the flows of finance capital, let's say. Or as Konstantinos has pointed out before, after 9/11, the United States, they had no trouble finding every bank account, every way through which Al-Qaeda was arranging its finance. It's not a technical impossibility that they can find.
Right.
Where all these people have their money, all these people who evade taxes and how the offshore banking system works. It's not as if this is beyond the capacity of the nation state to know. There's no political will, to do so.
Right.
So
right.
This is a more serious problem, of course, than it being a technical problem. And again, it speaks to the movement away from a vibrant political democratic, community. It is a really a great moment of, as Konstantinos says, heteronomy, where it's the markets, the market logic that dominates above all else, and whatever we think is, in the last instance, of no consequence.
Right. Konstantinos, since it's your article, we're going to give you the final word. Please. Yeah.
Final word for you. You presided.
It was great to see you, and we thank you so much.
It was so nice to see you, Konstantinos.
And we're really happy you're well, and keep well. And you too, Francis. You look great. I guess you're upstate, right?
Right.
Breathing good air. Yeah, you're great. Okay. Yeah. So thank you so much. This was wonderful. You want to say something, Francis?
No, just that it was lovely to talk to all of you.
Great.
Let's do it again.
We'll do it again. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And all the best. We'll see you in the summer, Konstantinos, for the Marxist summer school, to further discussions next year in Kassos. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.